The ENFJ and the ENTJ, well, on the surface, these types appear to be radically different from each other, don't they? I mean, one of them is posited to be this thinking, logical hard ass. The other type's posited as this feeling, communal kind of personality. Well, in reality, these two personality types are, in fact, very similar to each other, and there's actually a lot more similarities between them than there are differences. However, in this video, I hope to illuminate these differences and hopefully impart a framework with which to tell the difference between the two. So first up, I want to dispel a myth. The ENTJ is an extroverted feeler. The ENFJ is an extroverted thinker. If you know anyone belonging to either of these types in real life, you'll know this to be the case. You'll know that ENTJ is very active and lively around people, and they like to actively influence the social situation and monitor it. And you'll know that ENFJ is extremely logical, and they like to make sure everything is organized and going according to plan. Yes, there will always be some level of variation, but generally these two types have a lot of overlap in dominant functions. Taking the dominant stack of the ENTJ, we have an extroverted thinker dipping into extroverted feeling and applying this dual codec to the extroverted sensing world. The ENTJ is grounded in concrete reality when they're applying their external codec, and their maximal utility is towards the extroverted thinking environment. However, they will still employ extroverted feeling in order to enhance this utility. So yes, the ENTJ is predominantly concerned with getting a task done, with achieving a product or an outcome, with making sure the situation is on a more mechanical level, going effectively, going according to how they personally want it to go. Now let's take the dominant stack of the ENFJ. You have an extroverted feeler dipping into extroverted thinking, and again using this codec alongside a very precise lens of extroverted sensing in order to ground themselves into the concrete. So similarly, when the ENFJ is applying their external codec, they're grounded in the present tense and focused on a very small and detailed portion of reality. The ENFJ's maximal utility is through extroverted feeling, and therefore they are mainly concerned with the feelings, with the social atmosphere, with the communal task at hand. But they will still dip into extroverted thinking in order to enhance the effectiveness of the communal atmosphere. They will still dip into extroverted thinking in order to make sure that everyone is in harmony with one another. So how do you tell the difference here? Well, just look at the maximal utility. The ENTJ prioritizes the extrovert thinking, and that's where they're most playful. The dominant stack is convergent, which I'll get to in a second, and therefore the ENTJ is most concerned with achieving a creative outcome through a mechanistic means. The extroverted feeling component of the ENTJ will generally be a bit more authoritative, and therefore they'll be more evasive of negative emotional situations because they're less trusting in their ability to deal with them. The ENFJ, on the other hand, is very comfortable, very confident in their ability to deal with these negative emotional situations, but they're less confident in their ability to deal with mechanistic situations. They are creative and convergent in their use of extroverted feeling, therefore they'll be trying to achieve an extroverted feeling outcome, taking responsibility for the emotions of other people, while simultaneously being a bit more authoritative with their extroverted thinking and therefore trying to stick to the rules. So the ENTJ will be breaking the mechanical rules and abiding by the social rules, while the ENFJ will be breaking the social rules and abiding by the mechanical rules. And this is not to say that ENFJ is rebellious in any way, shape or form. No, they're actually quite conformist naturally. They like to embody the values of the subsector that they identify with. But they'll still be a lot more comfortable taking charge of a negative emotional situation. They'll be much more comfortable taking responsibility for it and achieving an outcome in line with the values of their particular social group. And this leads me to the divergent stack. The ENTJ is naturally more individualistic. Why? Because they have a divergent introverted feeling. Their oppositional function is introverted feeling with a divergent auxiliary, introverted intuitive lens, and therefore they'll be taking a very broad look at their emotional state. They won't have specific control over their emotions. Generally, because it's divergent, they don't have much control over their emotions in the first place anyway, so their emotions are compelling them into the future in order to achieve an ideal result. They'll be using their extroverted thinking and extroverted sensing in order to realize themselves in reality and make them more happy. And generally this type will be very individualistic. Divergent introverted feeling is usually a very individualistic codec, and therefore the type will be complying less with the wishes of other people. They'll be quite disagreeable by nature, and they will generally be manifesting their introverted feeling will into reality and ensure that their emotional needs are being met. The ENFJ, on the other hand, similarly has that introverted, intuitive, divergent auxiliary, compelling them to act towards a future vision. However, this is connected to an introverted thinking oppositional function. And therefore the ENFJ is less concerned with being this kind of hardcore individualist and more concerned with trying to comply with a set of rules, trying to understand reality on a deep level and live life in a very logical manner. The divergent introverted thinking compels the type to be logical. It compels the type to act in accordance with an inner sense of what is right objectively and what is wrong objectively. And as such, the ENFJ is a very disciplined individual. It's a very rule-abiding individual. You have a type who's very concerned with the truth, very concerned with the facts, and they often appeal to authority in order to make logical decisions. Since the most trustworthy authority tends to be research, this is where the ENFJ gravitates towards. They often excel in academic fields and they often place a lot of trust in pre-existing, reputable institutions and communities. So as such, you have an individual working towards the future in order to achieve a sense of maximal social utility. You have a type working on skill sets, you have a type working on deep logical understanding of specific areas of expertise, and then employing that in order to enhance their social utility, and even fit better within a niche of the society they trust. Whereas the ENTJ, on the other hand, will be working towards a future in which they are most happy and individualistically satisfied. They'll be working towards a future that is novel. They'll be working towards a future in which they can experiment. They'll be working towards a future in which they can realize their mechanistic ingenuity. And now that we've compared the dominant and the oppositional stacks, let's move on to the attitudes. So first up we have thinking. The thinking of the ENTJ is convergent. What does that mean? Well, it means that the type takes responsibility for their own logical circuits and is highly creative and seeks to form their own unique patterns, their own way of doing things. Therefore, the ENTJ is someone who likes to experiment. The ENTJ is someone who is highly individualistic in their approach to logic. The ENTJ tends not to be a fan of doing things by the book, and instead they prefer to do things their own way. They like to find their own methods and their own way to express their individuality through their machinations. The thinking of the ENFJ, on the other hand, is highly divergent. This means the type seeks to comply with pre-existing rules. They don't want to take too much responsibility for their own logical circuits, but they would rather absorb pre-existing logic and understand it and abide by it on their own terms. And if they have to, they can amalgamate different kind of theories, different external sources of logic together in order to form their own view based upon this. And this can be highly logical and will often make the ENFJ more reliable. But generally, the ENFJ will be much more authoritative in their logic. They will seek trusted sources and they'll seek to make sure that their logic is something they can trust within. The ENFJ engages with the social world at the behest of their introverted thinking. Therefore, they have an authority function compelling them to act in a way which is logical, compelling them to share this logic with other people, compelling them to make sure other people are abiding by the same set of rules. So despite the ENTJ being the thinking type according to the MBTI paradigm, it is actually the ENFJ who is most predisposed to behave logically. Because while the ENTJ seeks to find their own logic, their own way of expressing their individuality, that can make them great philosophers, it can make them great inventors, it is the ENFJ who acts in accordance with logical rules, with logical parameters within their mind. And as such, despite the acronyms implying the exact opposite, the ENTJ actually has a lot of overlap with the INFJ personality type because they both like to find their own way of doing things because they have their thinking in a convergent position. And on the other side of the coin, you have the ENFJ being much more similar to the INTJ because both types seek to abide by pre-existing logic and they seek to consult external manifestations of logic in order to instill within them a sense of logical authority to base their own emotions off. So the ENTJ and the INFJs are the hardcore individualists finding their own patterns and their own way of doing things, whereas the INTJ and the ENFJ are more rule-abiding people, they're very logical people who seek to comply with a pre-existing set of logical parameters. And now let's take the feeling functions. The feeling of the ENTJ is highly divergent, therefore they do not take responsibility for their feelings, not naturally anyway. Instead, the responsibility for their feelings tends to be handed to other people, to the external world if you like. Therefore they do things in order to make themselves happy. They feel compelled to do something, so they have a desire within them, and then they employ their mechanical genius in order to manifest their will within reality if you like. Therefore the type will be acting on feelings, they will be acting upon what they feel is best or even most in line with their own values, and then they will be expecting happiness in return. Divergent feelers tend to rely upon reward stimuli for their own happiness. Therefore the ENTJ will be acting in the external mechanical world in order to maximize the reward. They will, with a great deal of future tense orientation, be chasing rewards in order to make themselves feel better and in order to make sure that the external world is in congruence with their own personal values. Despite the fact that the ENTJ will often keep a very close circle of friends, they tend not to be particularly private individuals. They tend to be very open. They tend to be very gregarious, you could say. The ENTJ is often very sociable. The ENTJ is often willing to share a lot of information with a lot of people because they're not taking ownership of their emotions, and therefore their emotions are more or less happy to be displayed. And they tend not to be able to hide their emotions that easily. Anyway, so if an ENTJ is sad, you're going to know about it. They have that similarity with the INFJ again. The ENFJ, on the other hand, well, their feeling is convergent. Therefore, the type will be taking a more active responsibility for their emotions, and their emotions will be under their conscious control. The ENFJ is much more private than the ENTJ. They may even have a wider circle of friends than the ENTJ, people who they're really willing to let in and they can trust. But the ENFJ, around people they don't know, will generally be a lot less open. The ENFJ will be more guarded, and they're much more aware of their own vulnerabilities. As it's a convergent function, the extroverted feeling and indeed introverted feeling are highly creative in nature. The ENFJ will be finding new creative ways of engaging with social situations, resolving negative situations, encouraging positive social outcomes. And if something ever breaches their own values, breaches their own idea of what is logical, they will tend to be very vocal. And this is why ENFJs make great orators and leaders of movements, because they are willing to take responsibility for the emotions of other people and lead these people into a future which is more in line with the ENFJ's personal values of what is logical and what is not. The ENFJ is much less preoccupied than the ENTJ with chasing rewards, with chasing things in order to elicit maximum reward response. The ENFJ is in control of their own emotions, and as long as they have the affirmation and belief of other people, the ENFJ is willing to put themselves through a great deal of discomfort in order to realize a goal. As long as people believe in them, the ENFJ isn't as concerned about their own happiness as they are about realizing a goal in the future. Both types have a convergent extroverted sensing and a divergent introverted intuition, and therefore they are acting towards a vision of the future which is fairly set in stone that they're not actively taking responsibility for, all the while taking responsibility for the concrete reality that they manifest it within. And now let us address levels of consciousness. However, I will not be addressing this in the usual manner. The ENTJ's introverted thinking is fairly conscious, just as the ENFJ's introverted feeling is fairly conscious. The ENFJ's extroverted thinking is fairly conscious, and the ENTJ's extroverted feeling is rather conscious. And as such, we need instead to look at the lenses. Both types have an oftentimes highly unconscious introvert sensing. Therefore, neither type are particularly attuned to the concrete reality within their minds. They're not particularly attuned to the very specific details, and therefore they tend to have a fairly vague memory of concrete realities that have happened in the past. The introverted sensing of the ENTJ is connected primarily to their introverted thinking reality. This has two different possible ramifications. The first is that the ENTJ tends to forget where they've placed various different objects. They have a very uneasy relationship with the mechanistic contingency within the past. Therefore, they have difficulty remembering what chain of events has led to this specific outcome. And this means the type has a very hard time learning from their mistakes. They have a very hard time understanding how things have went wrong. If it's a relationship breakdown, they'll feel like, oh, well, that's just an incompatibility, but I don't know what actually happened, so I can't take responsibility for it. And if it's a more mechanical breakdown, the type feels, oh, well, it didn't work that way that time. I don't remember exactly what I did, but I'm just going to keep plugging away at it, and then hopefully over time, I'll do it in a different way. And this also leads to the ENTJ's predisposition to do things in a creative, convergent manner, their own unique way of doing things, because they don't really trust the set way of doing things. They don't trust what's happened and worked in the past. The ENTJ tends not towards tried and tested methods because they often cannot remember what those tried and tested methods are. The second way this can manifest is the simple bypassing of introvert sensing altogether. And in this instance, the ENTJ will be highly unspecific in their internal musings. They will be employing their introverted thinking, but rather than using the natural auxiliary to which it is attached, introvert sensing, they will instead jump to introverted intuition, pull that to a convergent state, and then kind of shoot out all of these kind of vague, plethoric formulas that may or may not be logical. In this instance, since they're bypassing introverted sensing entirely, you have a type who is perhaps the most inclined towards just taking jumbled kind of extracts from their introverted thinking cogitations and just throwing them out there into reality, whether they're logical or not. You have a type as such who can be very, very, very philosophical, but be very unreliable in the details. They'll be consulting their introverted thinking frameworks, using introverted intuition, but without an activation of introverted sensing, because they're bypassing that function, remember, the introverted intuition is incredibly broad. And in this instance, you have an introverted thinker who employs introverted intuition in its potentially most abstract form. And this can make the internal insights of the ENTJ highly original, highly abstract, but it can also make them unreliable. Therefore, it's imperative that ENTJ activates a level of introverted sensing in order to render their internal musings more specific and reliable. And the ENFJ has a very similar shady relationship to the past. However, their introverted sensing is connected predominantly to their introverted feeling. And again, this has two different ramifications. The first ramification is someone who cannot adequately reflect upon the emotional contingency within their introverted feeling landscape. Therefore, you have a type who is not aware of why they are unhappy. You have a type who is not particularly aware of the pattern of events that have led to them feeling a certain way. And therefore, it's a type who has difficulty reflecting upon past emotional experiences and learning from them. They can be highly original in their individuality, but they can also have difficulty formulating an identity they can rely on, because they cannot consult past emotional experiences in order to do so. Unlike the ENTJ, they can be very good at learning from logical mistakes. They're very much aware of the contingency of the external world and what pattern of events in concrete reality have led to a certain outcome, and therefore the ENFJ is very good at learning from failed relationships. The ENFJ is very good at learning from failed projects. But when it comes to what's personally made them happy, what's personally been successful insofar as their subjective self is concerned, the ENFJ will have a lot harder time reflecting upon those past tense components. The second ramification is someone who, similarly to the ENTJ, will tend to bypass their introverted sensing entirely. However, when the ENFJ does this, they are bypassing their introverted sensing in order to connect introverted intuition in a convergent manner to their introverted feeling. And in this instance, you have a type who's relying upon a kind of an archetypal, a very vague view of their emotional state, and they can only ever understand that emotional state as the entire sum of what it is. Therefore, they don't know why they're feeling a certain way. All they know is they're feeling a certain way and it conforms to this particular human archetype. That means they're very unspecific with their emotions, and even though they are taking an active responsibility for their emotions, they're not doing so with an introverted sensing lens, and therefore all they're doing is applying this extremely vague, hyper-introverted intuition to their introverted feeling, and generally lacking a sense of what specifically is making them feel a certain way, what specific emotional components are present within their brain, because all they feel is the summation of, I feel this way. And an ENFJ bypassing their introverted sensing in such a way tends to rely on hand-me-down archetypes in order to form their own identity. They will have a lot of difficulty forming their own individuality, and therefore they will rely on other people in order to essentially just hand them a role. This is my role, this is who I am, I'm just going to get on with it because now I don't have to think about it. I'm using introverted intuition, gazing at my introverted feeling in order to form the sum of my character as just a generic archetype that I did not have enough introverted sensing specificity to construct myself. And this is the primary influencing factor on why certain ENFJs can be extremely conformist, and why such ENFJs will rely so much on the affirmation of the people who gave them the identity in the first place. And the ENFJ in this instance will even be willing to compromise their own internal logic and instead replace that logic with the logic of the people who gave them an identity. Then it doesn't matter whether they have a certain amount of introverted thinking dissonance, because all that matters to them in this instance is retaining their identity and making sure they behave in a way which is congruent with the people who reflect that identity. And as such, for proper development of character, it is absolutely imperative that the ENFJ activates their introverted sensing and brings it into consciousness to be used in natural conjunction with their introverted feeling. And the second, potentially unconscious lens is extroverted intuition. Why I say potentially is because some types have this more consciously than others. However, for as long as they are engaging their introverted intuition, both types will tend to lack a conscious awareness of the plethoric details of the outer world. However, the codec to which this lens is attached varies between each of these types. The extroverted intuition of the ENTJ will be connected to the emotional atmosphere, and therefore this is a type who, when consciously aware of the emotional atmosphere, will be very good at operating within a group. They'll be very good at taking a broad view and performing even a leadership role within a group while aware of all the emotional implications. However, as is quite often the case, when the ENTJ's extroverted intuition is unconscious, this also means they have an unconscious relation to their extroverted feeling, at least in a divergent sense. For as long as they're using extroverted feeling in a divergent manner in order to just abide by the social etiquette of the situation, they can actually become so engrossed in a kind of introverted intuitive musing or an introverted intuitive consultation of their identity and values that they will lose track of what's going on in the emotional atmosphere, and then as a result they can begin to upset people, they can begin to be completely oblivious to the emotional implications of their actions, and this is when the ENTJ can potentially acquire that disagreeable and emotionally unintelligent stereotype associated with it. I would say that the extroverted intuition of the ENTJ is often quite acute, and in these instances you'll have quite an emotionally intelligent person. However, it is also equally possible for even someone who inhabits that state most of the time to still have slips, to still have moments whereby they're completely oblivious to the plethoric emotional atmosphere of the world around them. Similar with the ENFJ, as much as the ENFJ loves to apply a certain mechanical order to the plethoric world around them, there will be times when the ENFJ is so engrossed with the internal logic that they can lose sense of this external order. This is when the ENFJ can seem like a walking contradiction, because at the workplace or something they can be incredibly disciplined, incredibly conscientious and orderly, whereas in a home space, in a specific area of their house, for example, the ENFJ can completely lose this sense of order. They can seem to completely contradict their usual sense of conscientiousness and order, because suddenly they don't seem to be noticing anymore. They can literally have a blind spot in the extroverted intuitive atmosphere to the mechanical order that they can just be completely oblivious to. Because maybe when they're in that space, they are only ever employing introverted intuition to gaze into their introverted thinking circuits. So to wrap up, both types employ a high degree of both extroverted feeling and extroverted thinking respectively. However, the primary utility of the ENTJ is extroverted thinking, and they use extroverted feeling as a backup, whereas the ENFJ's primary utility is extroverted feeling, and therefore in this case they will be using extroverted thinking as a backup. The introverted intuitive divergent authority of both types compel them towards a vision of the future. However, while the ENTJ will be acting towards a vision of self-transformation, of self-realization, of happiness within the future according to what they are personally attached to, the ENFJ will be acting towards a vision of the future which is more logical, whereby they can manifest their introverted thinking logic and employ their expertise to the best of their ability in order to enhance their social utility. Looking at the attitudes, the ENTJ's thinking function is convergent. Therefore, they take responsibility for their own logical circuits and they seek to find their own unique way of doing things. They seek to do things in their own way, and they are very much a trial by error personality when it comes to the application of logic. The thinking of the ENFJ, on the other hand, is highly divergent. Therefore, this type appeals to authority. It consults research, it consults trusted institutions in order to inform its own worldview. It can then amalgamate these different views together in order to form its own view, and it will be compelled by this view, either external or internal, to act in a logical manner and to attain a certain level of orderliness and discipline. The feeling of the ENFJ, on the other hand, is highly convergent. Therefore, the ENFJ is willing to take responsibility for the emotions of other people and the emotional world around them. And since it's very specific, they tend not to like big crowds, they tend not to want to exert a lot of influence over a group of people, but they will be very comfortable doing a presentation or performing to a larger crowd, because then they're just interacting with the crowd as a singular SE component. They'll often find unique and creative ways of interacting in a social manner, and they will also be taking responsibility for their own emotions and as such be quite private a lot of the time, even to such an extent as to hide behind a mask, especially when in a business environment, for example. The feeling of the ENTJ, on the other hand, is divergent. Therefore, they do not take active responsibility for their own emotions. They tend to wear their emotions on their sleeves, and they rely on the external world to supply them with adequate reward stimuli as to keep their emotions satiated. Because their emotions inform their introverted intuitive authority, and therefore they will be chasing their own happiness. The ENTJ will be much less comfortable than the ENFJ taking responsibility for the emotions of another person, and as such, if the ENTJ wanted to cheer someone up, they would probably do so with a task, with an action, because the ENTJ is often an action speak louder than words kind of person. They can still be great to talk to, they can still be very empathetic, but generally they will not be as creative as the ENFJ with creating emotional harmony in the world around them. So I really hope that was useful. Please let me know what you think in the comments. I'd absolutely love to hear your own stories of ENFJs and ENTJs and how you personally tell the difference between the two. Make sure to leave a like on the video. It really does help the channel expand, grow, and reach even more audiences. And if you haven't already done so, make sure to click that subscribe button with the bell icon next to it to stay notified of future content. I upload a video every single week, so I'll be back, same place, same time, next week. Take care.